Hey, Miguel Iturrate back here on the CRP, and I'm joined by my MMA ace, Devin Miller, to go over the UFC Sacramento offering. This was UFC on Fight Night 155 and also UFC on ESPN Plus 13. So, a bunch of different labels for this card. The main event, Germaine De Randamie taking on Aspen Ladd, and we'll go from there. Devin, how you doing?
I'm doing good, Miguel. And what we saw here in this main event, just jumping right into it, is we saw a very experienced fighter that has a lot more high profile opponents and profile matchups going against a woman that was just too young, too inexperienced, and had a lot of trouble with weigh ins, which I think we'll probably cover a lot. And the fight ends 16 seconds into the first round, so there wasn't much to this fight, and it was a little underwhelming to say the least. But Randamy gets Aspen Ladd out there quick. What do you think, Miguel?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing more you can say. Aspen Ladd did have, an episode at the weigh-ins. I'll let you get into some of the details there. But once again, we have a fighter, looking, far from fight condition on weigh-in day and in front of the cameras and in a very public location. So, it always looks bad. And now what this is going to do with the 16-second win is it's going to, sort of open up the question as to whether Aspen Ladd should have been in the ring in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that it was like I don't think looking back at this that this was bad matchmaking or anything. I think it was more just. I mean, when it comes to Aspen Ladd's a girl that I've known about since before she was even in the UFC. She was on Ariel Hawani's show. She was an Invictus standout. She's been a top prospect for women's MMA for the past few years. People have known about her, and she's been pretty stellar in her UFC tenure so far. She struggled a little bit with Sajara Eubanks, but nevertheless, she got her out of there, and she comes out with the win. It was a close fight. Tonight, she was just going against a woman who has been around the block for a long time. I mean, Germaine De Randamie, people forget how good of a fighter she really is because, as I mentioned in a pre-fight video that I did on this fight, she really hasn't been able to overcome the reputation that she damaged so bad by refusing to fight Chris Cyborg. And anybody who doesn't remember that time frame, Jermaine Durandamy fights Holly Holm for a vacant 145-pound women's featherweight title in the UFC. And she got heavily criticized for that fight too for hitting Holly Holm after the bell multiple times and fighting somewhat dirty. She comes away with a very close decision win over Holly Holm. And then she refused to fight Chris Cyborg, which is who the UFC tried to match her up with for her first title defense. To the point where the UFC stripped her of the belt, and her reputation was really damaged bad with when it comes to the mixed martial arts community's audience. She drops down to 135 pounds, and she is the number one contender in this division, and she's on a very good streak. I mean, she's beat Raquel Pennington, Aspen Ladd now, and she beat Holly Holm up at featherweight. And she does have a loss on her record back at UFC Fight Night 31 back in 2013 to Amanda Nunes. But a lot of time has passed since then. We've got 6 years, and when you look at the trajectory of these two divisions right now, I mean, obviously they could run it back with Nunes and Cyborg, but if Nunes chooses to continue fighting, I don't know what more she can do to top the two wins she has over not only Cyborg but Durandamy also. So I don't really see the point in fighting either one of them again. She's got two first round finishes over both of them, but those seem to be her options, and I think Durandamy after tonight maybe put herself in that conversation. I think the Cyborg fight's more likely, but I think Durandamy is still a possibility. I would actually rather see Cyborg versus Durandamy, but Durandamy doesn't seem to think that that's a fight that she wants to fight, mainly because of Cyborg's past PED use and stuff. But um, she she went in there and took care of business quick against a young 24-year-old who's never really fought the caliber of a fighter that she was thrown in there against tonight.
I agree with you, and I think it's interesting what they'll do with De Randamie. I mean, I think based on the past history, as you outlined, they may have a villain there, and I don't know, how they're going to work in that. And I do agree with you. You question whether we might not see Amanda Nunes again. I mean, the bottom line is this sport has a pinnacle, and once you've been to the pinnacle, the motivation and things all change, and it is, an open question with each fighter once you've reached those heights, as to when they come back and how they come back, and it tends to stay away from it. Hey, well, there's a new wave of contenders in my weight class, and I'm just going to have to slog back in there and do a series of title defenses. The money and things like that always become an issue. So it's going to be interesting what we see with Amanda Nunes. But I think you're right. I think in dropping to 135, she sort of avoids Cyborg and sets herself up with a rematch that, at the end of the day, is probably the biggest money fight on the women's side in MMA.
It is, and something I brought up, Miguel, that I want your thoughts on this also is I think we're really starting to see that the UFC has a problem with their women's MMA roster right now, and it's not intentional. It's just the fact that if you really look at these divisions right now, the only one that's even at all interesting is women's strawweight. That's a very interesting division. You've got Jessica Andrade, Nama Yunus, Joanna's back down there, Michelle Watterson, Weili Zhang's getting a title fight. You've got Tatiana Suarez who's in there undefeated. That's a really interesting division. You look at 125 pounds, who is beating Valentina? You look at 135 and 145 pounds, Amanda Nunes has beaten everybody. And it would have been far more interesting going forward had Aspen Ladd gone in there and pulled off a great victory and really been able to implement her game plan on De Randamie, pull off a win, and she would have been an undefeated 24-year-old who had a lot of hype coming in. That would have been a fresh name for Amanda Nunes. And
go over what happened in the weigh-ins, though, with her.
When it comes to the weigh-ins, yes,
because I know you did a video.
That was one of the most. That was one of the most troubling weigh-in videos I've ever watched. That was hard for me to even sit through. She couldn't even get her feet on the scale without trembling really badly. But I'm not one of these types, Miguel. I know that you and Chad and I know that Amanda talked a little bit about it last week. I'm not one of the types that's pom-pomming my way into to fight day weigh-ins because I do believe that we would have a lot more day of fight pullouts if we went that way. I think no matter what, even if they have hydration tests like they have in ONE FC, you have them on the day of the fights. Number one, if the UFC was ever to go that route, and Bellator as well, immediately you got to scrap all their champions except for heavyweight because none of their champions are going to be able to. Kamaru Usman would all of a sudden be a 205er. He wouldn't even be a middleweight. He is a massive man for 170 pounds. Khabib Nurmagomedov would probably be a middleweight. He wouldn't even be able to making 170 pounds would be a tough cut at that point if you started to go down that route. So it would switch up the divisions completely. Number one, so it would be a total. They would need to give them some time off to even adjust to find out who's going to be in what weight classes. So that right there makes it very unlikely that it would ever happen. The number two thing is there's still going to be people that would try to ride that line of, well, how hydrated can I be and still compete? How dehydrated can I make myself to still get to a certain weight class? And then I think we would probably end up having more issues with certain regulations that are going into the weight cuts and how hydrated they need to be, and we'd probably end up with more fight day pullouts or people hurting themselves even more trying to make weight on the day of the fight. So I'm not sure that that's really a legit option moving forward. I'm a personal responsibility guy. The thing that I don't understand is how Aspen Ladd was even able to fight. She didn't look very enthusiastic tonight. She if she would have won, we would have said, oh well, she had a really calm demeanor. and she handled this stress free and looked great. But she didn't win. She got knocked out in 16 seconds, and she looked like she didn't even really was not even was she didn't look like she was walking to a cage fight, and she looked like literal death yesterday at the weigh-ins, and to the point where she couldn't even flex her bicep, she couldn't even step on the scale, and this wasn't even a title fight. It wasn't even a fight that she had to make 130. She could have weighed in heavy. But I understand a fighter's mentality that, there's 15, 20 grand that you could lose by missing weight. I'm going to make that weight. Lock me in the sauna. I'm 138 pounds right now, and I've quit sweating. Throw me in the sauna and leave me there. I mean, I've been there before. I cut from 163 pounds to 145 pounds once in 6 days. And it was painful, and I ended up losing in less than a minute. I got armbarred real fast, and I remember the pain that felt, how just not at all ready to fight I felt the next day. So I understand what she went through, and I don't think we saw the best version of her. But at the same time, I didn't prepare for my weight cut correctly, and for every horrible weight cutting story we don't hear about the 30 that went just fine. That the fighter properly prepared and took advantage of the resources and the science and everything available to him to properly make the weight.
Yeah, I know. I agree. I think it's a complicated question. I think you have to look at it from many different perspectives as a change is going to be made. I'm not, advocating that, but what I do want to emphasize is that what happened yesterday with Aspen Ladd, the weigh-ins, is to be avoided. This is not something that we need in any way, shape, or form in the sport. Part of it comes from self-monitoring and your team monitoring yourselves. Somebody's really got to step up and say there, look, we can't. You're not going to make this weight. You're now, you're moving up in weight class, and that happens to just about every fighter. Maybe on the women's side, it's not as clearly defined, or there's not as much information as on the men's side. But as the men age, they get, they have a harder time cutting weight, a harder time recovering. They tend to get, you know, bigger across the muscles in the back and things like that. And they tend to move up in weight more very naturally. And with the women, maybe that happens. Like I said, the problem is when you've got somebody. What happened yesterday, combined with the result of the main event today, it's all bad news. Because the situation is maybe she could have taken that punch if she had been rehydrated correctly. And we'll never know the answer to that. But just that we're dabbling in that neighborhood of risk, basically, is not a good sign for the sport, because the more we do it, the more you mess with it, something is going to happen. The reason you bring up ONE FC is because they do have a different policy, and the reason they have a different policy is because they did have a fighter pass away. So at least they tried to do something. I think they meant well with their policy. I'm not sure it would work internationally. And we had a situation there where, like, Eddie Alvarez, who's a natural 155 pounder, goes over there and fights Nasty Yakov, or I believe his name is. I know his the last name. Timothy, and I know part of his last name is Nasty, because that was a nasty knee, and he's a nasty man. And the bottom line is if you're going to fight at your walking around weight, then Nastyagov is a 170 pounder naturally, and he's walking around at that weight. Now Eddie's used to competing at 155. Who knows what size he came in at, or where that whole thing was, or does he walk around at 170? So he fought at 170, and maybe especially crossing over from one company that does it one way to another company that does it another way. There is real confusion for the fighters and real time for monitoring from the team and everybody else involved, the doctors and everybody, to make sure that fighter safety comes first, because you don't want to wind up with a tragedy. The UFC, for all is said and done, is a mainstream sport, and if something were to happen, like we've had happen on a smaller scale in ONE and things like that, the attention it's going to get is going to be very negative and very counterproductive towards the good that all the other fighters do put into the process, like you said. So yeah, just overall, the whole package of weigh-ins, 16-second fight, doesn't look good. Now,
it doesn't look good, Miguel, but I don't like and I'm not trying to just be like some nut hugger of the UFC and just act like they're not at all complicit with any of this, but at the same time I guess I am, because I don't put the blame on the UFC on this. They've done everything they can to try to make these fighters cut more, to have more successful weight cuts. Except for one other thing, which I think they need to do ASAP, is I think they need to add more weight divisions. I do. I think it's stupid, which it doesn't apply to the Aspen Ladd De Randamie fight, but I think it's totally stupid that they have 15 pounds between lightweight, welterweight, and middleweight, which are hands down. I mean, if you had an average weight for the average male athlete that's a combat sport guy, it's going to be between those weight. Those are the three most stacked weight divisions, and yet they have them separated so crazy. I mean, I think it needs to be 10 pounds. Boxing's a lot closer. Boxing has a lot more weight classes, and I don't think that. I agree with what Joe Rogan said for years. I don't believe it's the amount of weight classes that people don't prefer about boxing compared to the MMA. I think it's the fact that boxing has 4 or 5 different world champions for each weight class. I think that's more of an issue, not the amount of weight classes. I think that we do need a little bit more weight classes. I'm not saying I want to see them separated by 5 pounds all the way from 120 pounds to 215, but 10 pounds, 125, 35, 45, 55, 65, on up to 205, and then having a heavyweight division, I think is appropriate. And when it comes to the UFC, they've gave them the Performance Institute, where they are able to go get so much scientific information about their body fat percentage and what they need to do to make weight. Like, they've got all these different professionals that can coach them through weight cutting and what they need to do to make weight properly. They cut back the day before, pre day weigh-ins from 6 o'clock at night, when they used to weigh in at the show weigh-ins, to in the morning, so they have more time to hydrate. They've done everything that they can. These fighters just need to get it together. I mean, looking at Aspen Ladd, I mean, she's a big girl clearly, and she's young too. So I do think she'll end up fighting at 145 pounds in the future. But she's made 135 pounds before, and she didn't look like some girl that was just. She didn't look like T.J. Dillashaw at 125 pounds. So she looked like she could have probably made this weight. And I don't know if it's a dietary issue. I don't know if it's just a procrastination issue. I don't know what it is with her. But one thing's for sure, she cut way too much weight at the tail end of this weight cut and didn't look healthy. I think the commission should have stepped in. I would have never let. I don't care what promotion, what fans that hurt. I would have never let a woman looking like that fight the next day. And I think that there's probably a lot of people that are questioning whether that was the right idea, considering she just got knocked out in 16 seconds.
Yep. And, we had a little bit of a controversial co-main event in that it was the return of Urijah Faber. Urijah Faber, at this point, the California middle-aged man, because he can no longer be called the Cal kid, right? And, he made a successful return. We also got a co-feature that was under a minute long as he made short work of his opponent. Take us through that fight. What do you think? Because, is this now, are we going to see now? You got to put this in the context of, if you look back over the last 10 years in terms of popularity, social media, and things like that, and also, acumen from the fighters and things like that. I think, Urijah Faber is one of the more popular guys that they've had on board, especially in the lower weight classes, and it's because he's done a lot of work on all those aspects and things like that. Now, again, when you sum up and wrap up his career, everybody always talks about the failed attempts at the championships and how he never got a title run. Now, we're talking about a situation where bantamweight and maybe even a featherweight, at some point in the near future, he may impact the title picture again. Is that, something he's looking for? Because I don't know if that's appealing to me. If he's going to come back, you can keep him in a certain matchmaking range kind of thing. But to bring him back and put him right in the title picture, because he's popular, I don't know if I like that. What do you think?
I think that it does seem kind of like we don't really know, like we're not really nailed down to where we were on this fight when going in. We look at something like this about Faber coming out of retirement to fight a guy like Ricky Simone, who's ranked, who's a young guy, clearly a talented fighter, and we question whether Faber should come out of retirement to do this. And then when he wins, we turn around and look at it like, oh well, Simone wasn't ready to fight a guy like Urijah Faber, and that seems inconsistent. And I understand that, but the reason is because we don't, when we get these type of situations, we don't know what that guy that's coming back is going to look like. Is he going to still be the
Well,
same? Is he going to still be the same person? Is he still going to be the same fighter? Well, what we saw tonight is that Urijah Faber hasn't fallen off that much. But to answer your question, no, I'm not appealed by the idea of him fighting Cejudo or nothing. Um, Urijah Faber, I will throw some just applause toward him. I mean, this is a guy that was fighting in the WEC back in 2007. I mean, he was a dominant champion at the featherweight division at 145 pounds, dating back to the WEC days. And you're right that he did notoriously have his run in the UFC where he was winning every fight he was in, except for title fights. He lost.
I could tell you a funny Uriah Faber story from Abu Dhabi.
Go ahead.
Just really fast. One of the sponsors was one of the guys that runs American Top Team, and he had helped out, and he had gotten Carlos D'Amata into the event at 145 pounds. And D'Amata was black belt in jiu-jitsu, still is, and he still trains American Top Team fighters, and he's an excellent fighter. But his game is top game, and he got there was a preliminary bracket that got put out, and he got matched up with Joey Gilbert, who's a wrestler out of the Chicago area. And at some point or another, the phone calls were made, and a favor was done, and he got switched. So, but they switched to fight Uriah Faber, so it went terrible for him just the same. So it didn't wind up working for him, and his sponsor wasn't able to, pull any real favors for him there. But that was the first time I heard of Uriah Faber, and he showed up in Abu Dhabi and beat BJJ black belt.
Well, I remember like the old fight magazines, and back when in the day when MMA was really blowing up with the Ultimate Fighter, the UFC was blowing up. They had all these different magazines that were on CVS news counters and all this stuff about MMA. And Uriah Faber was one of the. I mean, he was legitimately a poster boy, and he was one of the ones that was very instrumental in moving the WEC and the UFC to consolidate because he was such a big name. I mean, he was, when you talk about those smaller weight classes, he was probably the first big name in those smaller
Oh
weight.
yeah, oh
And
yeah,
he ends up
he's
getting
a
knocked out.
historic guy. My problem with it, and to sum up like some of what you were saying, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I did just want to mention this because you've podcasted with me now for a little while, and you've heard me say this before. Here's the thing: is it would have been better for the sport if Ricky Simone had won this fight. It's okay for Uriah Faber to come back and maybe, for the next 18 months, he has, a 3 fight winning streak or whatever on his way out. Maybe we get a match with Dominic Cruz. Dominic Cruz comes back and you get some type of highlight reels and it becomes a good fight and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, for the 26-year-old to have shown the progress, that's what really would have been good for the sport. And, Uriah, sure, cash some extra paydays, baby. I don't care, but that's what it's about, He's trying to get some extra money. Nobody can knock him that. But now we have to see him. And I'm okay with seeing him, but he should probably be right around where Darren Elkins was on this card. Co-feature
Um,
spots no longer.
I was happy to see um Faber get the win tonight. I was cheering for him, but I want to see this be it. I like the idea of him coming out of retirement in Sacramento, in his hometown as the California kid, getting his feet wet one more time against a a pretty hyped and talented prospect, getting the win, and then just closing out the career with a great moment. I like that. I hope that's what he decides to do. I'm not confident that that will be. I think that he's probably going to see the dollar signs and let that draw him back in there. He did look like he was in great shape. He didn't look. I mean, he looks like he's found the key to anti-aging. I mean, I'll give him that. But I mean, I remember. I remember Uriah Faber as far back as his 5-round fight with Jens Pulver in the WEC days, and then getting knocked out by Mike Brown and his 2 fights that he had with Mike Brown. Him getting his I remember that image of Uriah Faber in
Breaking
bed
both
with his
hands.
leg propped up from getting leg kicked for 5 rounds by Jose Aldo. Just getting chopped down like a tree to the point where his leg was so swollen and bruised and black. I mean, it was just hideous. And then, I remember his first fight with Dominic Cruz where he submitted Cruz. That I remember his decision losses to Cruz, and I remember him running through guys. I remember his losses to Brow. I've got a lot of great memories about Uriah Faber, and I think that he is a Hall of Famer. He's one of the best that never won UFC gold, without a doubt. And I think he was a charismatic, always just. I mean, he's not one of those type of guys that's easy not to like. I just don't want to see him carry this out too long. I mean, I don't understand how this isn't enough.
Yeah, the bottom line is today's result still leaves him with a great story and a great finish, and he has a chance of not running that into the ground and making a mistake and going out like many other people have, which is on a down note. One of the things I will mention to wrap up our conversation here, and it sums up a lot of what you were saying here, is I've heard for many years now the call for more weight classes in the UFC and stuff. And people point to certain weight classes and say, "Hey, these are stacked weight classes. You can add a weight class there and stuff like that." But I would almost argue that the stacked nature of the weight classes, we still don't get all the fights that you want, from just what we have now at times, and that has to do with injury and things like that. And that what you're going to do is, if you're going to add, say, 3 weight classes, is that probably forces you to carry up to probably about 90 fighters added to the roster in order to have the competition that you have in these so-called stacked weight classes now. And are they ready to do that? Because if you look at the example of the men's lower weight classes and the women's weight classes, their commitment hasn't been as strong as 30 fighters deep in those weight classes. And really, that's what's shortened the women's weight classes and some of the other ones, is that the UFC's never fully committed to them. When they find a star, they work around that, bring talent in, and move things in there. But, in many of the women's classes, they don't have a roster that goes 30 deep where, you can say, hey, people are trying to break into the top 15 in the rankings. None of that exists. And that would become, you would be moving away from stacked weight classes. So, and then you would also have a lot of fighters jumping back and forth from one weight class to another. And then you get the silly boxing game of, Floyd Mayweather gets the claim he had 5 world championships in, 5 different weight classes. I think Pacquiao has already gotten himself up to 8 different weight classes where he's a champion. And literally, you might pause in a weight class, win the championship, and then abandon it and go to the next one and things like that. So I'm not sure that that's the answer for a perfect world either.
I agree with you to an extent. The only thing that I differ on is when we look at lightweight and welterweight, Miguel, those are the 2 best divisions in the sport. And I would say middleweight comes in number 3. And at one time, I remember watching the UFC back in the Matt Hughes, Rich Franklin, Chuck Liddell, and Tim Sylvia days, where those were the only divisions. They had heavyweight, they had light heavyweight, they had middleweight, and then they had welterweight. And then they started bringing in these lower divisions by 10 pounds. Well, I'm not saying we should start throwing in a 195 division. I don't think there's the talent there. I mean, we already have a thin division at light heavyweight right now. We have a thin heavyweight division. I'm definitely not saying we should have some like cruiserweight division up at like 215 or 225 like some have called for. I don't believe in that. I think we're fine from heavyweight to light heavyweight down to middleweight. If I would really only add 1 weight class, I would just move welterweight to 175. And Kamaru, that'd be good for guys like Kamaru Usman that are clearly gigantic guys for 170 pounds. And then open up that 65 division to where we would have guys like George Masvidal and um, maybe even Khabib moving up, and
Kevin
guys
Lee.
like RDA and all this stuff that would be there that are a little too big for for lightweight, but a little too small for somebody like Kamaru Usman and Tyron Woodley and stuff. And I think that we would have healthier. Then we would have a 10-pound progression from 25 all the way to 85, where I think would be. I think that that'd be healthy, and I think it would also open up potential for. And when it comes to like boxing, I mean, you got 130, 135, 140. What is it? 140, 140, then 140.
140, 147.
Yeah, and you got a lot of divisions that are like 5 pounds apart. I can only conceive of a fighter maybe getting three belts. I mean, and it would probably be somebody like Khabib at like a 55 to 60. Actually, it would probably be somebody like Connor or something that fought at 45, was able to make 45, became a champion there, was able to win it at 55, and maybe was able to get the right matchup and win it at 65. Maybe like a 55, 65, and 75 champ or something. I can only conceive of maybe three, or like a Frankie Edgar who was the 55 champ, has been a title contender at 45, but it has always been somebody that probably could have been fighting at 35 pounds in his career. Something like that could possibly happen, but that would be an exceptional fighter. It would be very rare. So I think we're gonna have a lot of these champ people. Another thing is that we've seen guys that have moved up in weight class here recently that look better, and I think that not having them have to cut so much weight to avoid fighting people that are so freaking huge, I think would probably be better. But I don't know. The UFC doesn't seem committed to that. They don't seem committed to. I don't. It confuses me. I mean, I don't know why they're so committed to 15 pounds between welterweight and lightweight and welterweight and middleweight, but they seem to be. I mean, that's a lot of weight, Miguel. I mean, compared to
Well, no, I understand what you're saying. When the UFC started, there were no weight classes, right? And then in the UFC's Puerto Rico show, they did a David and Goliath tournament where you had the first inkling of weight classes, which was over 200 pounds, under 200 pounds. And they operated like that for a little while with the 200-pound weight class different. And then they moved it to 205 basically in the Tito Ortiz era. And I don't know if Tito would ever have been able to make 200, right? At that point, they came along and they said, we're going to add the lightweight division. And what they did was they truly added the welterweight division because Pat Miletich and Mikey Burnett fought the initial lightweight world title fight, and it was at 170 pounds at the UFC in Brazil. So the 170-pound weight class is one of the three, core original weight classes because when you consider that, Pat Miletich was the title holder, it was at that point that you had legit smaller athletes entering the UFC. Mikey Burnett was a smaller guy, but the guy specifically I remember coming over was a wrestler named Townsend Saunders. He didn't make a huge splash in wrestling, but in MMA. But you're talking about a cream of the crop elite wrestler that came over and did UFC fights. At some point, he would never have come over to fight 200 pounders, right? So it was a crossroads division. So 170 has a little bit of a place in history, not that that's necessary. I think the best argument that you laid out is probably the safety and health issue, and that would probably be the only way that you can convince me.
well, also like a guy like something like take for instance Kelvin Gastelum is the best example I could think of from the middleweight to welterweight um, space. He is somebody who is not a big middleweight at all. He should not be fighting a middleweight. We saw that in the Chris Weidman fight. Not so much in the Adesanya fight because Adesanya is the guy that just doesn't really. He's not an imposing guy. He's more of a tactical technique style striker. But he's still not. I mean, I cannot imagine Kelvin Gastelum as good as he is fighting Yoel Romero. I mean, dude, the physical stature that those two guys are fighting in the same weight class is insane. but he struggled really hard making welterweight, so he moved up in weight class. He would be somebody that would be perfect for a 175-pound division. And then you got guys like RDA, who we saw in the Kamaru Usman fight. Kamaru Usman looks huge for 170 pounds. I think RDA, I think maybe even Robbie Lawler could possibly even maybe cut down to 65. I know that he's fought 85 before, but he's superhuman, so that's rare. I know Masvidal could make it. He quit going down to 55 and went up to 70 because the cut down to 55 was just too much. But he's not a. I mean, if he fights Usman, he's going to look small compared to Usman. Um, I think it's a much better separate. And then you got Kamaru Usman, who there's no way we're going to see him at 165 pounds. I mean, we know that that's the limit. I think it'd be safer for Usman not to have to cut that extra 5 pounds down to 70, then cut to 75, and for Colby Covington to cut down to 75, and Ponzinibbio to cut down to 75, Tyron Woodley to cut down to 75, and then you got other guys that could possibly maybe cut 5 more pounds and be a little bit bigger and still healthy, like a Jorge Masvidal and stuff. I'm a fan of it just because I know that those weight classes are just so freaking stacked, but at the same time, is it something that I'm gonna be? I'm gonna lose sleep over if they don't make it happen. I mean, it's not like that.
Don't hold your breath because Dana doesn't like the idea, and usually Dana gets what he wants too, right?
Yeah, but let Dana get a potential Khabib versus GSP fight that makes sense, and GSP won't do it unless the title's on the line. And GSP says, let's create the. I mean, if Conor McGregor would have continued to defend the 55 belt, he would have ended up either fighting for the welterweight title at 170, or they would have ended up creating a new division for him, so that he could be the first 3-division champion. I mean, these things, people, their decisions change so rapidly when there's a storyline attached to it. Dana does seem very, very, very hardcore against it, which surprises me. I mean, it's surprising.
Well, I think what you have to realize too is that from a management perspective, stability is key, and the end of the day is you happen to have guys like Gastelum and things like that on your roster right now. So, but it's not a great reaction to go ahead and make a wholesale change, like a weight class change, because Gastelum will fade, Kevin Lee will fade, these athletes will fade. You'll have a new roster, and it's like all of a sudden it's like, fuck, we may need a 180-pound class next, or whatever it is. It really is always going to be the variable of this is what your roster looks like now, and what you can ask guys to do and not do. So just because the argument of just because the roster would benefit right now from it is not a good argument, because again, fast forward 5 years or go back 8 years, 5 years, or whatever, the weight classes might not be that talented. You might have one with a gap. So, but like I said, the strongest argument may be the health argument, because if that's really the case, and I do think that those are the weight classes where you do see some of the most extreme weight cutting, 185 included. So,
Kevin Lee was another name you brought up that it makes that's another one that I think comes with my point.
No, there are fighters
you could not fight at 55 pounds, but he is not a big welterweight.
There are fighters you can look at on the roster, and certainly you can justify it if you're looking at it that way. But like I said, just because your roster is constituted that way now, what do you do if this happens again a few years down the line at a weird weight class or whatever? Are we going to add a weight class now? Is that the solution to your logjam there? Maybe, on top of that, like I said, I think, to reasonably do the weight classes, they do aim for a roster of about 30 fighters in those weight classes and stuff. And I think you'd start to water that down a little bit. And I think, they do talk about nowadays, it's like, it's crazy to think about, but they do talk about nowadays is like, with a win, he'll break into the top 15, and then from 15, they start to work their way up and things like that. So, a lot of that would change that they have established. I think that's probably why Dana's, against it as well. So I think we had a great discussion. UFC was in Sacramento, UFC Fight Night 155, UFC on ESPN 13. Main event, co-main event, You got about a minute's worth of action total with both fights as Germaine De Randamie and Urijah Faber both had big wins there to end it. So we had a little bit of an early night. I got together with our man Devin Miller to recap the main events. And the conversation snaked into a couple of other territories there, but definitely well worth watching and always great discussing the world of MMA with my guy here, the ace Devin Miller. How you doing for this fight night, Dev? Any final words?
No, I think we covered the main talking points of the event, and also talked a little bit about weight classes. I do want to give a shout out just briefly because we don't need to go too in depth, but Josh Emmett looked really good tonight, pulling off a big win. First round stoppage over Mirsad Bektek, and um, big power for a 145-pound fighter. I mean, he got knocked out by Jeremy Stevens, but came back, knocked out Michael Johnson. Now he's knocked out Mirsad. He knocked out Ricardo Lamas back in the day, but he's definitely a viable contender against anybody they put him in there due to that power, due to that big power for that weight class. So Josh Emmett, he was one of the standouts for me tonight.
Yeah, I agree. I think overall it was a pretty good little card. You sometimes don't get to see every fight, and I did get to watch every single one of them. And there were a few standout moments in there. Ryan Hall also looked spectacular. I have a soft spot in my heart for Darren Elkins, out of Indiana, who's fought for me before. But Ryan Hall handled him, and Ryan Hall, another one of these exceptional ground guys with a little bit of a flair and a little bit of a different game. So, if I had to mention somebody that jumped out at me on Ryan Hall is one. You had veteran Andre Feely notch a win there as well on the undercard, and I agree with you. Josh Emmett definitely looked good.
Yeah, Philly was another one that I thought looked really good tonight, and has looked really good in his last few fights, and got a big hometown win. So there were some good names on this card, and it wasn't the most eventful, especially from what we've been spoiled with lately. But it was a good card, and I think me and you are going to be back here talking a lot about next week, because I think the Leon Edwards RDA fight has a lot of implications, especially when Miguel, we've talked about it's been like a sweepstakes type of thing we've talked a lot about on here this year about who's going to fight Conor McGregor if he does come back. Well, now I think George Masvidal is getting in that conversation, because you got possibly Usman. You got him calling out Conor McGregor. Nick Diaz was scheduled last year to fight him, and that fell through. You got the Nate Diaz Anthony Pettis fight coming up, and one of those two could easily fight Masvidal, and would be a big fight. But I think people forget that he did just give quote unquote the two or three piece with the soda to Leon Edwards in Leon Edwards' hometown after the Darren Till knockout, and Leon Edwards is on a 7-fight win streak, and if he beats RDA, will be ranked in the top 5 in this division. So that fight could really happen. So I think that fight's an important fight next week. I'm very excited to see that fight. I think Leon's being slept on, and I think it's interesting. I think we're gonna have a lot to talk about moving forward about who's gonna fight Masvidal now, who I think is. Like I said, we talked a lot about who will fight Conor. I think a big question now is who will Masvidal fight next, because I think he's that big of a star now.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the UFC is going to go ahead and do the Colby Covington title fight. That Masvidal will be forced to wait, and that's where that is going to sit there. So anyway, that's the end of the CRP's recap of UFC Fight Night 155. Hit like, subscribe, visit the channel, and we'll be back with Devin Miller throughout the week here. Thank you very much.